The year is 166 AD. The Roman Empire is at the height of its power. 60 million people live under Roman rule. From the deserts of Syria to the forests of Britain. From the rivers of North Africa to the frozen banks of the Danube. No empire in the history of the Western world has ever been this large, this connected, this powerful, and the man sitting at the top of it all does not want to be there. His name is Marcus Aurelius, and on this particular night, he is not sitting in a golden throne room. He is not hosting a banquet. He is not watching gladiators fight. He is sitting alone, writing, not writing orders, not writing laws, writing to himself, private notes, reminders, confessions, arguments with his own mind about how to be a better human being. Outside his window, 2 legions have just returned from war in the east. They have defeated the Parthian Empire, one of Rome's most fearsome enemies, and they are marching back through the city in triumph. But the soldiers have brought something back with them, something invisible, something far more dangerous than any army, a plague. Historians will later call it the Antonine Plague. Some believe it was smallpox, others believe it was measles. Whatever it was, it is spreading faster than fire through dry grass. Within months, 2,000 people a day will be dying in Rome alone. Within years, the total death toll will reach 5 million, perhaps 10 million, perhaps more. And Marcus Aurelius will watch it all. He will manage it. He will try to contain it. He will write plague management letters and organize burials and keep the empire functioning even as the ground shifts beneath his feet. But that is not even the worst thing happening to him right now, because at the same moment the plague is killing his people, there are reports of massive Germanic tribes massing on the northern frontier. Hundreds of thousands of warriors who have never respected the Roman border and now, emboldened by the chaos of disease, are beginning to push through it. And somewhere in this empire, someone Marcus Aurelius trusts with his life is quietly, secretly, planning to take everything from him. How did it come to this? How does one man face plague, invasion, betrayal, and war, all at the same time, and not break? How does a man who never wanted to be emperor become the greatest emperor Rome ever produced? And what does it do to a person to carry the weight of the world on their shoulders for 20 years without anyone to share it? This is not a story about a perfect man. This is the story of a man who was handed something he didn't ask for, surrounded by forces he couldn't fully control, and who chose every single day to face all of it with reason, discipline, and radical honesty. This is the story of a philosopher forced to become a warrior, a pacifist who spent more time on the front lines than in the palace, a man who wrote the most famous journal of personal philosophy in human history, not because he was wise, but because he was desperately trying to become better. This is the story of the last of Rome's 5 good emperors, and the man whose son would begin the empire's long, slow collapse. This is Marcus Aurelius, and it's time to understand him completely. Chapter 1. The Boy the Emperor Noticed, April 26th. 121 AD. A boy is born on Caelian Hill in Rome. His father's name is Marcus Annius Verus. His mother's name is Domitia Lucilla. They are wealthy, Roman aristocracy, the kind of family that has money, political connections, and a name that opens doors. But the boy's father dies young, before Marcus is even 3 years old. So Marcus grows up in his grandfather's house. His grandfather, also named Marcus Annius Verus, because the Romans were not particularly creative with names, is a 3-time consul, one of the most powerful men in Rome. Marcus grows up surrounded by senators, philosophers, lawyers, military men. He grows up watching how power actually works, not how it looks from the outside, how it functions from the inside, and he watches carefully. This is the first thing you need to understand about Marcus Aurelius. He was an observer from the very beginning. While other aristocratic boys were competing for status, Marcus was watching, studying, asking questions. His tutors notice immediately. The boy is exceptional. He devours philosophy, rhetoric, grammar, geometry. He studies painting. He practices wrestling, not because he loves competition, but because he understands physical discipline. He learns to box, he hunts, but above all else, he reads. By the time he is 12 years old, Marcus has fallen in love with Stoic philosophy, and not just reading it casually, he is living it. He sleeps on a hard board instead of a soft bed. He wears simple clothing when he could wear the finest silk. He pushes back against luxury not because he has to, but because he genuinely believes that comfort makes a person soft, and softness, he thinks, is a kind of death. His tutors are amazed by this child, and word is beginning to spread. In the palace, Emperor Hadrian is paying attention. Hadrian is one of Rome's most capable emperors. A builder, a traveler, a military strategist, and like all great rulers, he is constantly searching for talent, watching the next generation, looking for the future. What he sees in young Marcus impresses him deeply. Ancient sources tell us that Hadrian gave Marcus a nickname, Verisimus, the most truthful one. Because even as a child, Marcus refused to say things he didn't believe. He refused to flatter. He refused to perform in a court built entirely on performance, on flattery, on political maneuvering, on saying one thing and meaning another. This child was genuinely, uncomfortably honest. Hadrian found it fascinating. But this is where the story gets complicated. Hadrian had no children of his own. And as he aged, the question of succession became urgent. He needed to choose his heir carefully. His first choice, a man named Lucius Aelius, died unexpectedly, a massive setback. His second choice was Antoninus, a quiet, steady, deeply respected senator who would come to be known as Antoninus Pius. But here is the critical detail that most people miss. When Hadrian adopted Antoninus as his heir, he attached a condition, a non-negotiable condition. Antoninus had to adopt 2 boys as his own sons. One of them was Lucius Verus, the biological son of Hadrian's original choice who had died, and the other was Marcus, the 17-year-old boy from Caelian Hill. Hadrian essentially looked at this teenager and said, "I want you in the line of succession. I want you near the throne. Not for now, but eventually." Marcus, by all accounts, was not thrilled. This is not legend or romantic interpretation. We can read Marcus's own words in the private journals he would later write. He tells us clearly that being near power made him uncomfortable. He was not ambitious. He did not crave the throne. He found imperial court life exhausting, but he did it anyway, because Marcus Aurelius, even at 17, understood something that most adults never grasp. You don't get to choose your circumstances. You only get to choose how you respond to them. He was adopted. He moved into the imperial household. His name changed to Marcus Aelius Aurelius Verus Caesar, and his education, which was already extraordinary, was about to become something else entirely. Chapter 2. The Making of a Philosopher King. There is a specific kind of pressure that comes from being chosen, not born to the throne, not seized power, but chosen, pointed at, and told, you are the one. Marcus felt this pressure every day of his adolescence, and rather than letting it crush him, he did something unusual. He studied harder. He assembled a remarkable group of tutors, more than a dozen of the finest minds in the Roman world, philosophers, lawyers, rhetoricians, military advisors. He wrote about many of them in his private journals, with genuine warmth and specific gratitude. Not as political connections. As teachers he actually admired. His most important teacher was a man named Marcus Cornelius Fronto. Fronto was the greatest Latin orator of his age. He tutored Marcus in rhetoric, the art of persuasion, of public speaking, of constructing an argument that could move people. In later life, Fronto would become one of Marcus's closest friends, and their personal letters have survived to this day. They are full of affection, full of intellectual debate, full full of the kind of honest friendship that Marcus always valued above social performance. But Fronto gave Marcus something beyond rhetoric. He gave him permission to question everything. And Marcus, who had already been questioning everything since childhood, took that permission and ran with it. The philosophical tradition that Marcus was most drawn to, Stoicism, was not new. It had been founded centuries earlier by a Greek named Zeno of Citium, who taught in a painted porch called a stoa in Greek, which is where the name Stoicism comes from. But Marcus was not just drawn to Stoic ideas intellectually. He was drawn to them personally, viscerally, because Stoicism offered answers to the specific questions that kept young Marcus awake at night. How do you stay mentally stable when everything around you is chaos? How do you handle a power you didn't ask for? How do you lead people without becoming corrupted by the very act of leading? How do you face death, your own death, the deaths of the people you love, without being destroyed? These were not academic questions for Marcus. These were survival questions. Because even as a teenager, he understood that he was heading toward a life of impossible difficulty. He could see it coming, and he wanted a philosophy that would not just tell him what to think, but tell him how to be. Stoicism gave him that. At its core, Stoic philosophy makes a single, radical distinction. There are things within your control and things outside your control. And the entire project of living well, the entire goal of philosophy, is to understand which is which. Your body, outside your control. It will age. It will get sick. It will die. Other people's opinions, outside your control. People will admire you, fear you, hate you, misunderstand you. You cannot change this. Your reputation, outside your control. Your wealth, outside your control. Whether you're born rich or poor, powerful or powerless, completely outside your control. But your thoughts, inside your control. Your values, inside your control. How you choose to respond to what happens to you. Always, completely, totally inside your control. This distinction, which sounds simple and is actually devastatingly difficult to live, became the foundation of everything Marcus Aurelius did for the rest of his life. When the plague came, outside my control. How I respond to the plague, inside my control. When the barbarians invaded, outside my control. How I lead the response, inside my control. When someone betrayed him, outside my control. Whether I let it destroy my character in response, inside my control. Over and over and over. For 20 years, but here is something important that most discussions of Marcus Aurelius miss. He was not naturally calm. He was not born serene. He was not a person who found Stoicism easy. In his private journals, the ones we know as the Meditations, Marcus is constantly arguing with himself, constantly reminding himself to do better, telling himself not to lose his temper, not to indulge self-pity, not to seek praise he doesn't deserve. He sounds, in many passages, like someone in a genuine struggle, because he was. Marcus wrote the Meditations entirely for himself. He never intended anyone to read them. They were private notes, reminders, self-corrections, arguments, mantras, that he wrote during some of the most brutal years of his life. When you read them, you are not reading a polished philosophical treatise from a wise man who has it all figured out. You are reading someone trying desperately to hold themselves together. And that is why, 2,000 years later, people are still reading them, because the struggle is universal. And watching someone face that struggle with this level of honesty and effort is one of the most inspiring things a human being can do. But we are getting ahead of ourselves, because before Marcus ever wrote a single word of the Meditations, something happened that would test everything he thought he knew. Emperor Hadrian died. The year was 138 AD. Marcus was 17, and now the man he had been adopted by, Antoninus Pius, sat on the throne of Rome, and Marcus was his heir. The world was about to become much more complicated. Chapter 3. The Mind Behind the Throne. For the next 23 years, Antoninus Pius ruled Rome, and for those 23 years, Marcus Aurelius watched from the closest possible distance. He was not just an heir in name. Antoninus made him a genuine partner. Marcus served as consul twice. He sat in on councils. He studied how decisions were made, how generals were managed, how the enormous machinery of empire was kept running. It was a masterclass in governance, and Marcus soaked up every lesson. But there was a tension growing inside Marcus that these years could not resolve, because the more he learned about power, the more he saw how it actually functioned, the more he became convinced that power was fundamentally dangerous to the human soul. The Stoics had warned about this. They had a concept called hegemonikon, the ruling faculty of the mind, the part of you that directs your thoughts and choices, and they believed that exposure to certain environments, luxury, flattery, unchecked authority, was like poison to the hegemonikon. It corrupted your ability to reason clearly. Marcus saw this happening to people all around him. Senators who had started as honorable men becoming sycophants, military commanders whose victories made them arrogant, wealthy friends who had lost the ability to distinguish between what they needed and what they merely wanted. And the terrifying thought that Marcus returned to again and again in his private writing was this: what if it happens to me? What if being emperor, the most powerful position in the known world, surrounded by people who will tell you whatever you want to hear, corrupts him too? Slowly, subtly, without him even noticing? This fear is not hypothetical in Marcus's meditations. He writes about it directly. He gives himself specific instructions to guard against it. He lists the things that Roman emperors had historically become: arrogant, decadent, vicious, and explicitly tells himself, do not become this. He writes about Alexander the Great, who died drunk and delusional. He writes about Julius Caesar, who became so certain of his own greatness that he made himself a king and was stabbed 23 times in the Senate. He writes about Caligula and Nero, emperors he knows were corrupted entirely by power. And then he writes something that stops you cold. He writes, how many Alexanders, how many Caesars, how many Neros has the world already forgotten? He is telling himself, you are not special. You will also be forgotten. The only thing that matters is whether you were good, whether you lived according to your values. This is not false modesty. This is a man with 23 years of proximity to power conducting a daily, rigorous psychological maintenance program on himself, because he understood what psychological research has confirmed 2,000 years later. Power changes the brain. Multiple studies in contemporary psychology and neuroscience have documented what researchers now call the power paradox. When people gain power, they tend to become less empathetic, less able to accurately model other people's experiences, more focused on abstract goals, and less attentive to the human individuals affected by their decisions. This happens gradually, invisibly. The powerful person usually doesn't notice it. Marcus Aurelius, with no access to modern neuroscience, diagnosed this exact phenomenon through sheer philosophical observation, and he spent 20 years trying to inoculate himself against it. His method was essentially a form of systematic cognitive training. He would deliberately remind himself, in writing, of his own mortality, his own limitations, the smallness of Rome in the context of history, the smallness of history in the context of time. He wrote, "Look at the rivers in the past, and at those which will come in the future, and at those now flowing. Look at the lives of men long ago, and of those in the future, and of those now living. How many of them have not even heard of your name? How many will soon have forgotten it?" He was using perspective as medicine. Every time his ego swelled, every time he felt the intoxicating pull of imperial grandeur, he would deliberately shrink himself back down to size, not as self-punishment, not as false humility, as maintenance, as keeping the instrument sharp. There is another psychological technique that appears constantly in Marcus's private writing, and modern psychologists have a specific term for it: negative visualization. The Stoics called it premeditatio malorum, the premeditation of evils. The practice was simple in concept and brutal in execution. You regularly imagine losing the things you love most: your health, your children, your freedom, your life, not as a morbid exercise in despair, but as a discipline of appreciation and preparation, because, the Stoics argued, the person who has never thought about losing what they love is the most vulnerable when they actually do lose it. They have no reserves, no mental framework. They collapse. But the person who has regularly, honestly, unflinchingly contemplated loss develops a kind of psychological resilience. They appreciate what they have more fully, and when they actually do face loss, they have already partially grieved it. They have already practiced. Marcus would need this practice because loss was coming in ways he could not yet imagine. For now, though, 161 AD, Antoninus Pius is dying. He is old. He has ruled for 23 years, and as he lies on his deathbed, he speaks his final order: Atheiwanimitas, equanimity, calmness, steadiness, the ability to remain emotionally stable in the face of whatever comes. It was his final word, his final lesson, and then he was gone. And Marcus Aurelius, who had spent his entire adult life preparing for this moment while privately dreading it, stepped forward. He was 40 years old. He was now the most powerful man on earth. And his first act, his very first act as emperor, was something that shocked everyone. Chapter 4. A throne built for two. When Marcus Aurelius became emperor, he could have taken the throne alone. Every previous emperor had done exactly that. There was one throne, one emperor, one supreme authority. Marcus refused. On his first day as emperor of Rome, he insisted that his adoptive brother, Lucius Verus, be made co-emperor with equal status and equal power. The Senate was stunned. This had never happened before. Rome had never had two emperors ruling simultaneously with equal authority. It was constitutionally unprecedented, logistically complicated, politically risky, and Marcus insisted on it anyway. Why? The most common interpretation is simple duty. Lucius had been adopted along with Marcus. They were both supposed to be heirs. Marcus felt honor-bound to include him, but there is something deeper here, and it reveals the psychological complexity of Marcus Aurelius in ways that a surface reading misses. Marcus did not trust power. He did not trust what power did to the people who held it, and part of him, a significant part, did not fully trust himself with absolute authority. By creating a co-emperor, he was building in a check, a counterbalance, a person who could push back against his decisions. This is a psychologically sophisticated move. Most people who gain power want more power, not less. The instinct is to consolidate, to centralize, to eliminate competing voices. Marcus went the opposite direction. He gave power away, not out of weakness, out of wisdom. The Stoics had a term for the dangerous illusion of imperial infallibility. They called it the tyrant's disease. The belief that because you are powerful, your judgment is always right. That dissent is disloyalty. That opposition is treason. Marcus was determined not to catch it. Now, there is an important caveat here. Lucius Verus was not Marcus Aurelius. Where Marcus was disciplined and austere, Lucius was extravagant. Where Marcus studied philosophy, Lucius preferred parties. Where Marcus pushed himself to be better, Lucius seemed quite content with who he was. Ancient sources described Lucius as charming, physically imposing, popular with the crowds. He was good-natured. He was not cruel. He was not stupid. But he was not Marcus. And privately, very privately, Marcus had his doubts, not about Lucius as a person, but about whether this arrangement would work as the pressures of empire began to mount. Those pressures arrived sooner than anyone expected. Within months of Marcus and Lucius taking the throne together, a crisis exploded on the eastern frontier, the Parthian Empire. Rome's great rival to the east, centered in what is now Iran and Iraq, had invaded the Roman client kingdom of Armenia. Then they invaded Syria. Then they destroyed an entire Roman legion. This was not a skirmish. This was a full-scale war declaration. Marcus made a decision. He would send Lucius to command the Eastern campaign. It was in many ways the perfect assignment. Lucius had nominal authority. He was co-emperor. Sending him to war gave him a role, gave him prestige, gave the public a figure to rally behind, and it kept the daily governance of Rome, the endless, grinding administrative work that Marcus genuinely believed was the real job, in Marcus's hands. Some historians have interpreted this as Marcus sidelining Lucius, sending him somewhere less important so Marcus could have the palace to himself. But there is evidence that it was more strategic than cynical. Marcus genuinely understood his own limitations. He was better at governance than warfare. Lucius, for all his faults, was charismatic and commanded genuine respect from soldiers. More importantly, Marcus sent Rome's best generals with Lucius, men like Gaius Avidius Cassius, a ferociously talented military commander who would later become the most important figure in one of the darkest chapters of Marcus's life. For 3 years, the Eastern War ground forward. Lucius stayed largely in comfort in Antioch. Historians note that he spent more time at the games and feasts than at the front, but his generals were brilliant, and they were winning. Mesopotamia fell to Rome. The Parthian capital of Ctesiphon was sacked. By 166 AD, it was over. Rome had won a decisive victory. Lucius returned to Rome in triumph. Both emperors celebrated, but the soldiers who came back with him were carrying something, and what they were carrying would change everything. Chapter 5. Death marches west. The cheering was still echoing through the streets of Rome when people started dying. The soldiers who had marched to Parthia and back were thin. Many were coughing. Lesions appeared on their skin. Their eyes were red and hollow. At first, Roman physicians thought it was fatigue. The effects of long campaign give them food and rest, and they would recover. They did not recover. Within weeks, the disease had spread beyond the returning soldiers. It moved into Rome's population with terrifying speed. Through the crowded tenements of the Subura district, through the markets, through the baths, those great public gathering places that Romans used daily and which had now become engines of infection. The symptoms were brutal: high fever, diarrhea, inflammation of the throat, skin eruptions, a black rash that covered the body. Marcus's personal physician Galen, perhaps the greatest medical mind in the ancient world, documented the plague in meticulous detail. He described patients on the 9th day of illness developing black pustulas across their skin. He described the lungs failing. He described the particular smell that attended the disease, distinctive enough that experienced physicians could diagnose it before symptoms fully appeared. Galen was brilliant, but even he had no real answer. Roman medicine, for all its sophistication, had no germ theory, no understanding of viral transmission, no concept of isolation protocols that modern medicine takes for granted. What they had were prayers, sacrifices, and Marcus Aurelius, because this is the moment, the first truly catastrophic crisis of his reign, where you begin to see what Marcus Aurelius was made of. Most emperors in ancient history responded to crises with one of two strategies: suppress the information or perform elaborate public rituals that looked like action while actually doing nothing. Marcus did neither. He acknowledged the scale of the disaster openly. He organized systematic distribution of resources, food, burial assistance, medical supplies, to affected areas. He personally reviewed strategies for limiting spread. He ordered the burning of plague materials in affected districts. He also raised a new concern that showed remarkable administrative foresight. The plague was killing soldiers, and Rome at this moment in history desperately needed soldiers because the northern frontier was beginning to move. This is the crucial intersection of crises that made Marcus Aurelius's reign so uniquely brutal. The plague was not just a public health catastrophe. It was a military catastrophe. Entire legions were being decimated. Training camps were spreading disease. The careful, calibrated defensive system that protected Rome's northern border, maintained through disciplined deployment of healthy, experienced soldiers, was breaking down, and the Germanic tribes beyond the Danube knew it. For generations, the Germanic peoples of northern Europe had existed in an uneasy relationship with Rome, sometimes trading, sometimes raiding, occasionally being recruited into Roman legions, but never seriously threatening Rome's territorial integrity. That was about to change. Around 166–167 AD, a confederation of Germanic tribes, primarily the Marcomanni and Quadi, from what is now the Czech Republic and Slovakia, began making unprecedented incursions across the Danube frontier, not small raids. Entire armies. They crossed the Danube. They moved through Pannonia. They swept through Noricum, a Roman province that had been quiet for 2 centuries, and then they did something that shocked Rome to its foundations. They crossed the Alps. For the first time in nearly 300 years, a foreign army was inside Italy. The last time something like this had happened, Rome had nearly ceased to exist. The psychological impact on the Roman population was immense. This was supposed to be impossible. The legions were supposed to stop exactly this. The entire apparatus of Roman military might, all those roads, all those fortifications, all those drilled and disciplined soldiers, was supposed to prevent exactly this. And now there were Germanic warriors burning villages in northern Italy. Marcus Aurelius received the news, and then he made a series of decisions that history would remember. First, he sold off the imperial treasures to fund the war. Not metaphorically, literally. The palace treasures, the gold, the statues, the precious objects accumulated over centuries of Roman imperial wealth. He sold them in a massive public auction in the Forum, because he refused to raise taxes on a population already devastated by plague. Second, he began personally recruiting soldiers in ways Rome had never done before. Freed slaves, gladiators, barbarian mercenaries. Anyone who could fight was being brought into the legions. This was genuinely radical. It marked the beginning of a transformation in Roman military culture that would have consequences for centuries. Third, and most significantly, Marcus prepared to go to war himself. He was 46 years old. He had never commanded an army in battle. His health was already compromised. He suffered from chronic chest pain and stomach problems throughout his life. He had no particular desire for military glory, but the Stoics had taught him something he kept returning to in these years. First, say to yourself what you would be, and then do what you have to do. He wanted to be a good emperor, and right now being a good emperor meant going to war. In 168 AD, Marcus and Lucius both left Rome and headed north. The Marcomannic Wars had begun, and they would not end for the rest of Marcus's life. Chapter 6. The Barbarian Tide. Marcus Aurelius and Lucius Verus reached Aquileia, a critical city at the head of the Adriatic, which served as Rome's gateway to the north. In 168 AD, the situation was serious, but it was still manageable. Then Lucius Verus died on the return journey from the northern campaign, before any major battle had even been fought. Lucius suffered what ancient sources describe as a sudden stroke. He was 38 years old. Just like that, the co-emperor was gone, and Marcus was alone. How did Marcus feel? He never tells us directly, but we can read between the lines of what he wrote. Lucius had his flaws, his extravagance, his love of pleasure, his lack of discipline, and Marcus had been frustrated with him more than once, but he had also genuinely cared for him. They had grown up together. They were brothers in the most literal legal sense, and in a real emotional sense too. Now he was gone, and Marcus had to continue, because the Marcomanni were not waiting for him to grieve. The Germanic tribal confederation that Marcus now faced was genuinely formidable. These were not disorganized raiders. They were peoples with their own complex societies, their own military traditions, their own excellent metalwork and cavalry. They had been watching Rome for generations. They knew how Roman armies moved. They had learned from previous defeats, and they were unified by a common goal. They needed land. This is a crucial context that often gets lost in dramatic retellings. The Germanic tribes pushing against Rome's northern frontier weren't simply bloodthirsty raiders looking for treasure. They were peoples under pressure themselves, from further east, from colder weather, from population growth that their existing territories could no longer support. The Romans saw barbarians. Marcus, to his credit, seems to have sometimes seen something more complex. He is recorded as attempting negotiations with various tribal leaders. He offered settlement arrangements. He tried to find ways to absorb Germanic peoples into Roman society, rather than simply crushing them. This approach was not universally successful, but it was genuinely unusual for the era. And it tells you something important about Marcus's psychology. Even in the middle of a war, he was trying to understand the people he was fighting, not out of sentimentality, out of strategic intelligence, because Marcus believed, and the Stoics reinforced this belief, that all human beings shared the same essential rational nature, that the Germanic warrior and the Roman senator were, at the deepest level, made of the same stuff, motivated by the same basic needs. Understanding your enemy as a human being makes you a better tactician. It also, Marcus believed, made you a better human being. The war itself was brutal, grinding, and slow. This was not the kind of warfare that produces famous battles with famous names. This was attrition. Roman armies fighting through dense forests against an enemy that refused to engage in the open battles where Roman legions excelled. The Marcomanni, the Quadi, the Sarmatians, they used the terrain expertly. They raided and retreated. They struck supply lines. They picked off isolated Roman units in ambushes that the classic Roman formation was poorly equipped to handle. Marcus responded by adapting. He issued new military guidelines, essentially the first systematic reform of Roman tactics in generations. He trained his men for forest warfare. He modified equipment. He established an unprecedented network of forts and roads along the Danube that would define Roman defensive strategy for centuries after his death. He was not a natural general, but he was a ferocious student of it. Year after year, the campaign ground forward. Victories, setbacks, alliances broken and reformed, treaties made and abandoned, and through all of it, Marcus Aurelius lived with his armies on the northern frontier. Not in a palace, not in comfort, in military camps, in all weathers, eating soldiers' food, witnessing soldiers' deaths, and writing, always writing, in the margins of military life, between campaigns, during winters when the Danube froze and fighting paused. Marcus was composing the notes to himself that would eventually become the Meditations, which brings us to the psychological core of who Marcus Aurelius actually was. Because the Meditations are not just philosophy, they are a window into a mind under enormous stress, a mind trying, day after day, not to break. Chapter 7. The Man Who Wrote in Darkness. Somewhere on the Danube frontier, in a tent that smelled of leather and mud and wood smoke, the Emperor of Rome is having an argument with himself. He writes, "Begin the morning by saying to thyself, I shall meet with the busybody, the ungrateful, arrogant, deceitful, envious, unsocial." He is reminding himself, first thing in the morning, that the people around him are going to be difficult, that they will disappoint him, that they will be selfish and ungrateful and annoying. And then, this is the critical part, he tells himself not to let this surprise him, not to let it make him angry, not to let it make him cynical, because they are human beings, and human beings are like this. And you, Marcus, are also like this sometimes. So do not hold them to a standard you cannot always meet yourself. This is the voice of the Meditations. It is not a triumphant voice. It is not a serene voice. It is the voice of someone in the middle of a genuine battle, not with Germanic warriors, but with their own character, their own tendencies, their own fears and irritations and impulses toward giving up. We know from medical historians that Marcus suffered from chronic physical ailments throughout his adult life. There is strong evidence of ongoing chest problems, possibly a lung condition. There are references in ancient sources to him eating very little, experiencing stomach problems, having trouble sleeping. He was not a healthy man, and yet he commanded armies, adjudicated legal disputes, managed administrative crises, wrote philosophy, maintained relationships, and held an empire together. Modern psychologists who have studied the meditations have noted something fascinating. The text reads remarkably like a form of cognitive behavioral therapy. Centuries before the concept existed, CBT at its core is about identifying irrational or unhelpful thought patterns, challenging them with reason, and replacing them with more accurate and productive perspectives. That is almost exactly what Marcus is doing in the meditations when he writes, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." That is not an inspirational quote for a gym poster. That is a man actively talking himself out of anxiety about things he cannot control when he writes, "Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be. Be one." That is someone cutting off their own procrastination, their own perfectionism, their own excuse-making when he writes, "The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." That is someone who has trained themselves to reframe obstacles as opportunities, not because it comes naturally, but because they have practiced it so many thousands of times that it has become the default response. The psychological sophistication of Marcus's self-management was genuinely extraordinary for any era. He understood what modern neuroscience calls the negativity bias, the tendency of the human brain to weight negative experiences more heavily than positive ones, and he had a specific practice for counteracting it. He would deliberately, consciously, systematically remind himself of everything that was going well, every person who had helped him, every piece of good fortune he had received. He also understood what psychologists now call cognitive distancing, the ability to observe your own thoughts as if from the outside, rather than being swept away by them. He writes frequently about watching his own mind at work, about treating his thoughts like something he could examine, question, and choose to act on or not. This is not a natural human skill. Most people are inside their thoughts, identified with them, controlled by them. The Stoic practice of constant self-examination that Marcus had been doing since childhood had built in him a remarkable capacity to step outside his own mental states and evaluate them rationally. But here is the crucial, complicated truth that makes Marcus Aurelius more interesting than any sanitized portrait of him. He did not always succeed. The Meditations are full of evidence that Marcus Aurelius, like every human being who has ever tried to live according to a demanding ethical standard, failed repeatedly. He writes about losing his temper and immediately regretting it. He writes about being disgusted by certain people, catching himself judging them, and then arguing with himself about why that judgment is unfair. He writes about moments of self-pity, moments where the weight of everything, the war, the plague, the administrative burden, the constant loneliness of supreme authority, threatens to become too much. It is not death that a man should fear, but he should fear never beginning to live. He wrote this, he believed it, and sometimes he had to remind himself 30 times in a day to actually live it. This is what makes the Meditations so different from almost any other philosophical text in history. It is not a record of wisdom achieved. It is a record of wisdom pursued. Marcus was not a sage. He was a student. And the fact that his classroom was the throne of Rome, that the stakes for his philosophical failures were not just personal but imperial, makes his effort to get it right one of the most remarkable stories in human history. But there is one more psychological dimension of Marcus Aurelius that we have not yet explored, and it is perhaps the most important one. Marcus genuinely wrestled with violence. He was an emperor. He commanded wars. He ordered executions. Though far fewer than most of his predecessors or successors, he oversaw gladiatorial games, though he tried to make them less lethal, insisting on blunted weapons wherever possible, and famously turning his attention to administrative paperwork during matches rather than watching. But he found violence troubling, not just morally, but cosmically. He could not reconcile the Stoic belief in the rational unity of all humanity with the fact that his role required him to send men to kill other men. He never resolved this tension. The Meditations don't resolve it. What they show is a man living inside the tension, doing what his role required while never making peace with the cost of it, never allowing himself the emperor's most tempting psychological escape, the belief that the dead didn't really matter because they were just enemies, just obstacles, just nameless masses beneath the dignity of his grief. He tried to remember that each of them was someone. Sometimes he succeeded, and then he would go back to planning the next campaign, because the war was not over, and something was about to happen that would be a very different kind of betrayal than any Germanic blade. Chapter 8. The knife in his back. His name was Gaius Avidius Cassius. Remember him? The ferociously talented General Marcus had sent east with Lucius during the Parthian War. The man whose military brilliance had actually won Rome that conflict while Lucius enjoyed Antioch's pleasures. By 175 AD, Avidius Cassius was the governor of Syria. He commanded most of the Eastern Roman armies. He was widely respected as one of the finest military minds of the generation. He was also, in the estimation of many in Rome's political elite, something of a natural successor to the throne. And then something strange happened. A rumor spread through the eastern provinces. The rumor said that Marcus Aurelius was dead. The sources are unclear on where the rumor started. Some ancient writers blame Faustina, Marcus's wife, suggesting she had begun quietly backing Cassius as a potential successor because she was worried about Marcus's declining health and about what would happen to her and her children if he died unexpectedly. Whether Faustina was actually involved remains one of the great historical controversies of Marcus's life. The accusations against her may have been political slander. They may have been true. We cannot know for certain. What we know is this: Avidius Cassius believed the rumor, and he declared himself emperor. When Marcus Aurelius received this news, on the northern frontier, still managing the Germanic wars, not dead at all, the shock must have been immense, not just politically. Personally, Cassius was not some distant rival he barely knew. He was a man Marcus had praised publicly, a general he had trusted, someone who had served Rome brilliantly under his rule. And now he was a rebel. Now he was a traitor. The Senate immediately declared Cassius a public enemy and demanded his destruction. The military reaction was swift. Cassius did not have majority support from the eastern legions. Many commanders remained loyal to Marcus. And crucially, when news spread that Marcus was actually alive, Cassius's moral authority collapsed immediately. He had based his claim on Marcus's death. Marcus wasn't dead. Within 3 months, Avidius Cassius was assassinated by his own officers. His severed head was sent to Marcus. Marcus refused to look at it. He also, and this is the detail that defines his character more than almost any other single action, refused to allow the Senate to execute Cassius's supporters. He pardoned them. He gave explicit instructions that no senator, no family member of Cassius, no civilian supporter of the rebellion was to be harmed. He released them. He returned their property. He wrote letters to the Senate explaining his reasoning, and his reasoning, documented in multiple sources, was thoroughly stoic: that executing innocent people related to a traitor did not make Rome safer. It made Rome crueler. It destroyed the goodwill of a population that had not chosen rebellion, and it set a precedent for punishing guilt by association that would inevitably be used against innocent people in the future. The Senate was frustrated. This was not how emperors handled treason. Treason demanded blood. Marcus refused. But there is a private dimension to Marcus's response to this crisis that we find in the Meditations, written during this period, because Marcus was not simply calm about the betrayal. He was hurt. He had trusted Cassius. He had valued him. And Cassius, for whatever reason, under whatever misunderstanding or ambition, had moved against him. Marcus writes in the Meditations about the challenge of being betrayed by people you trusted, about the temptation to become hardened against future relationships, to stop trusting people in order to stop being vulnerable to betrayal. He explicitly rejects this response. He writes that closing your heart to human connection, making yourself immune to betrayal by making yourself immune to trust, is not wisdom. It is a smaller kind of dying. It is letting the betrayer win twice, once in the act of betrayal, and again in the permanent contraction of your capacity for connection. He also, and this is remarkable, writes about trying to understand why Cassius did what he did, not to excuse it, not to minimize it, but because Marcus genuinely believed that the person who acts badly almost always does so because of false beliefs about what they need, what they deserve, what they are entitled to. Cassius was not evil in Marcus's psychological framework. Cassius was mistaken. He saw the world inaccurately, and pity, real pity, not contemptuous pity, but the pity you feel for someone who is fundamentally confused, was more appropriate than hatred. This is an extraordinarily demanding moral framework to actually live inside. Most of us, when betrayed, want anger. We are entitled to anger. We feel it, and it feels right. Marcus felt it too. He was human, but then he worked through it. Every time the rebellion crisis passed, Marcus returned to the northern frontier. The Marcomannic Wars continued, and his health was getting worse. But there was one more thing Marcus had not yet fully confronted. One more challenge that, if we're being completely honest, he may have handled less well than any other crisis in his reign. The question of who came after him. Chapter 9. The son he should have feared. His name was Lucius Aurelius Commodus, Marcus's son, born in 161 AD. The same year Marcus became emperor, a child of the throne, a boy who had grown up surrounded by absolute power, by deference, by the specific atmosphere of an imperial court where every adult was attuned to the wishes of the emperor's son, and Marcus loved him. This is the great contradiction at the center of Marcus Aurelius's story. This is the thing that historians, philosophers, and psychologists have debated for centuries. Marcus Aurelius, who understood the corrupting influence of power better than almost anyone in Roman history, who had spent his entire adult life designing psychological defenses against exactly that corruption, who had studied the case histories of what happened to emperors' sons who grew up surrounded by unchecked authority. That same man chose to make his biological son his heir. He had adopted sons available. He had excellent generals, administrators, capable men who had proven themselves through actual merit, and he chose Commodus. Why? The honest historical answer is, we don't fully know, but we can speculate with some evidence. Part of it was likely genuine love. Marcus was a devoted father. He had multiple children, many of whom died young, and the loss clearly devastated him. Commodus, who survived, and who was physically gifted and charming, may have represented something precious and irreplaceable to a father who had lost too much. Part of it may have been practical politics, the system of adoption of the best man that had produced Rome's previous excellent emperors. Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus had worked partly because those emperors had no biological sons. The moment a capable biological son existed, the pressure to pass power through blood became enormous. Part of it, and this is the psychologically uncomfortable suggestion, may have been Marcus's one significant blind spot. He could see clearly through almost everything, but he could not see his own son clearly. Love did not permit it. Marcus began bringing Commodus into his governing role early. At 15, Commodus was made co-emperor, the youngest in Roman history to that point. He was brought on campaign, shown everything, given every opportunity. The problem was immediately apparent to the generals and administrators around Marcus, who watched with growing concern. Commodus was not interested in governing. He was interested in gladiatorial combat. He was interested in physical display, in spectacle, in the specific pleasures of being adored. He was not particularly cruel as a young man. Cruelty came later, but he was bored by administration. He was impatient with philosophy. He had no interest in the demanding, unglamorous work that Marcus had devoted his life to. He was, in essence, everything Marcus had spent his life trying not to be. Marcus saw this. He must have seen it, and he made the choice anyway. The Meditations are conspicuously silent on the subject of Commodus. There is almost nothing in the private journals about Marcus's son, which is itself a kind of answer. Marcus wrote about everything that troubled him. The things he didn't write about were the things that were perhaps too painful to examine. There is one entry, brief, oblique, where Marcus writes about the difference between what we hope for and what we should expect, about accepting that even our best efforts to shape someone's character cannot override that person's essential choices. It reads like someone trying to make peace with a decision he has already made, a decision he suspects is a mistake, but a decision he cannot bring himself to reverse. Some historians argue that Marcus made the only pragmatic choice available, that the system would not have accepted any other heir, that attempting to pass power to an adopted non-relative would have created civil war. Others argue that Marcus, the philosopher who spent his life insisting that duty trumped personal desire, should have been able to make the hard call, and didn't. Edward Gibbon, the great historian of the Roman Empire, was blunt. He said that Marcus Aurelius choosing Commodus was the beginning of the end, the moment when Rome turned a corner from which it would never fully return. Because what Commodus eventually became, and we will not fully tell that story today, as it deserves its own documentary, was one of the worst emperors in Roman history. He renamed Rome after himself. He declared himself Hercules reincarnate. He fought in the gladiatorial arena himself, not as sport, but as imperial spectacle. He executed senators on whims. He delegated governance to corrupt favorites while he played at being a god. He was assassinated in 192 AD, 12 years after Marcus died, and the chaos that followed took generations to resolve, the last of the 5 good emperors. And then this, but that is what came after. Right now, in 175-107 AD, Marcus is still alive, still ruling, still fighting, and there is one more war to fight. Chapter 10, The Last Campaign. Marcus Aurelius spent the final decade of his life fighting, not metaphorically, literally, on the frontier, in the cold. After the suppression of the Cassius Revolt in 175 AD, there had been a brief period where peace along the northern frontier seemed achievable. Some of the Germanic tribes had made genuine peace settlements. There had been negotiations, arrangements made. Marcus had believed, or perhaps wanted to believe, that the worst was over. He was wrong. By 177 AD, the Marcomanni and Quadi were fighting again. The peace settlements had collapsed. New incursions were beginning along the entire Danube frontier. Marcus, who was now 56 years old, who was ill, who had never wanted to be a soldier, prepared for war again. He brought Commodus with him this time, ostensibly to give the young man military experience, perhaps also to keep him nearby, to prevent the kind of power vacuum that had allowed the Cassius Revolt to develop, and perhaps, though Marcus would never have admitted this, even to himself, to see if war would forge in his son something that palace life had not. The campaign of 178-180 AD was militarily going well. Marcus had spent years building the Danube system. His generals were experienced. The legions were battle-hardened. The Roman military machine, for all the damage the plague and years of war had done to it, was still the most formidable fighting force in the world. The tribes were being pushed back. Some historians believe Marcus was close to a decisive victory, something that might have allowed him to advance Rome's northern frontier significantly, potentially incorporating Germanic territories that had resisted Roman control for 2 centuries. We will never know, because in the winter camp of Vindobona, the city we now call Vienna, Marcus Aurelius got sick. The nature of his final illness is debated. Some ancient sources suggest plague. Some suggest a recurrence of the chronic chest condition that had plagued him for decades. The ancient biography called the Historia Augusta describes a man who knew he was dying and chose his response deliberately, the same way he had chosen every other response. Ancient sources describe Marcus as death approached, summoning his generals, reassuring them, giving orders, making arrangements. He summoned Commodus, and here the sources give us a scene that may be historical or may be legend, but which feels psychologically true regardless. Marcus, it is said, told his son what he needed to be, what Rome needed from him. He spoke of duty, of the service that power demands, of the difference between an emperor who is served and an emperor who serves, whether Commodus listened, whether any of it reached the young man who would soon rename Rome after himself and fight lions in a spectacle arena while senators begged for their lives. We cannot know. What we do know is what Marcus Aurelius did next. He refused food. This was not passive death. Multiple ancient sources describe Marcus as actively choosing the manner of his dying, withdrawing from food, turning away from visitors, preparing himself for the end with the same deliberate intention with which he had prepared for everything else in his life. The Stoics had a concept for this: euthanasia, a good death, a death faced with calm, without excessive weeping, without excessive drama, without clinging. Marcus had been preparing for this for 40 years. He had written about it hundreds of times. He had practiced the mental acceptance of his own end so many times that when it actually came, there was nothing left to learn, nothing left to resist. He called in his friends. He told them not to mourn excessively. He said something, the sources record slightly different versions, that was essentially, "Why do you weep for me? Think instead of the plague and of the many that have died." Even in his dying, he was arguing against self-pity. Even at the very end, he was still trying. On March 17th, 1880 AD, Marcus Aurelius died. He was 58 years old. He had ruled Rome for 19 years. The soldiers who heard the news wept, not the ceremonial weeping that attended the deaths of emperors as political performance. Real grief. The grief of men who had camped beside this man for years, who had watched him eat soldiers' food and sleep in soldiers' tents and hear soldiers' complaints with genuine attention. He had been one of the very few emperors in Roman history who seemed, by all accounts, to actually care whether individual human beings lived or died. And now he was gone. Chapter 11. What the World Lost. Cassius Dio, the Roman senator and historian who lived through the reign of Commodus, wrote something remarkable about the moment of transition. He described the shift from Marcus to Commodus as the descent from a kingdom of gold to one of iron and rust. He meant it politically. He meant it practically. Commodus was, by most measures, a catastrophically bad ruler, but Dio also meant something deeper. He was describing what it felt like to live in an empire that suddenly had a different quality to it, a different spirit. Under Marcus, the empire had felt, for all its wars, all its plagues, all its grinding difficulties, directed towards something. There was a sense that the man at the top was trying, was genuinely, exhaustingly, consistently trying to make correct decisions for correct reasons, not always succeeding, but trying. Under Commodus, the machinery continued to run because Rome's administrative structure was strong enough to function without engaged leadership, but it ran without purpose, without the moral weight of someone at the top who actually believed that power was a burden and a responsibility rather than a gift and a pleasure. Commodus believed in Commodus. Marcus believed in something larger than himself. That difference, multiplied across millions of people and decades of governance, is immense. The Meditations survived. They almost didn't. They were not published in Marcus's lifetime. They were private notes, never intended for wider circulation. For centuries after his death, their existence was uncertain, but they survived, copied and recopied by monks in medieval monasteries who may not have fully understood what they were preserving, but understood that it was worth preserving. And when they finally emerged into broader European awareness, during the Renaissance, and then more fully in the modern era, they hit readers with the force of something genuinely new, not because the ideas were new. The Stoic philosophy Marcus was drawing on was centuries old, but because of who was writing them. This was not a philosopher writing in comfortable safety. This was not an academic producing theory. This was the most powerful man in the world, surrounded by war and plague and betrayal and the grinding weight of empire. writing desperately to himself in the dark about how to be better, how to stay human, how not to lose what mattered inside all the pressure to lose it. The Meditations have never been out of print. 2,000 years after Marcus Aurelius died in a military tent on the Danube frontier, his private notes are read by millions of people who find in them something they cannot find elsewhere. Not certainty, not easy answers, something harder to name but more valuable. The company of someone else who is also struggling, someone else who is also trying, someone else who understands the difficulty of being human and refuses to pretend it is anything other than what it is, which is sometimes beautiful and always difficult. Ending. The last good emperor's last lesson. There is an irony in the story of Marcus Aurelius that he would have appreciated. He spent his life preparing himself for death. He wrote about death constantly. He practiced the acceptance of mortality with such discipline and consistency that you might think, by the end, it had no power over him at all. And yet the things he could not control, the plague, the wars, the choice of his son, have haunted his legacy for 2,000 years. He could control his thoughts. He could control his values. He could control his effort. He could not control the outcome. This is perhaps the most important lesson of his life. Not that Stoic philosophy produces perfect outcomes. Not that if you just think correctly and live well enough, history will reward you. Marcus Aurelius thought correctly and lived well, and the son he chose still unraveled much of what he built. The lesson is harder than that. The lesson is that outcomes are not the measure of a life. Marcus Aurelius did not judge himself by whether the empire was thriving. He judged himself by whether he was trying, whether he was honest, whether he was present, whether he was doing the right thing in this moment, with these circumstances, with what he actually had available. The rest, as he said in a dozen different ways across the Meditations, was not up to him. What he left behind was not a perfectly functioning empire. Rome declined and fell, as all empires do. What he left behind was a way of being, a template for facing impossible pressure without losing yourself, a demonstration that you can hold enormous power and remain human, that you can be surrounded by every temptation toward cruelty and choose mercy instead, that you can be betrayed and choose forgiveness, that you can watch everything you love threatened or destroyed and still, in the morning, get up and try again, that you can write in the dark, to yourself, for yourself, with no audience and no applause, about how to be better, and that this attempt, this lifelong practice of trying, is itself a kind of greatness that no amount of plague or war or bad succession can erase. Marcus Aurelius wrote, "Do not indulge in dreams of what you have not, but count up the chief of the blessings you do have, and then thankfully remember how eagerly you would have sought them if they had not been yours." He wrote, "The best revenge is to be unlike him who performed the injury." He wrote, "Never esteem anything as of advantage to you that will make you break your word or lose your self-respect." He wrote, "You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength." He wrote all of this in the dark, on the frontier, in the middle of wars and plagues and betrayals, not because he had figured it out, because he was trying to. The last good emperor died on March 17th, 1880 AD, in a military camp on the Danube, surrounded by soldiers he had led for most of his life. He died doing his duty. He left behind an empire that would eventually fall, and a book of private notes that never would. Waste no more time arguing about what a good man should be one. Marcus Aurelius.